So this is four sources of college funding, and this is intended to be a brief overview, not a deep dive. And it's geared toward undergrads, but it also applies to grad students as well. And I know this can be a really deep, heavy topic, and so I'm going to do my best to keep it interesting and keep you from being bored out of your mind. So here's what we're looking at first. And you can see this spreadsheet here, and what you want to focus on. No, I'm just kidding. This is not what we're going to do at all. What I do want to start with, though, is this chart here. And this data comes from collegeboard.org, and it's a national average of four-year public colleges. And the blue line there is the sticker price. The orange line is the net cost. And very few people pay sticker price. It's much less than 5%, and depending on where you look, it's either 2 or 3%. But colleges really appreciate those people that do pay sticker price because they make a lot more money off them. But for most people, you're looking at the net cost, which on a national average is about $14,500. And we get down to the net cost by utilizing some of these buckets. And I say there are four buckets of college funding. There's really five. The fifth bucket is savings, and that's a college savings plan like a 529 or a bank account, something like that. And there are strategies around savings, but for what we're going to talk about today, I'm not going to go through those. What we're looking at here with these buckets is, I like to think of this as it's someone else's money, whether it's the federal government's money, the college's money, maybe a bank's money. It's using other sources of money besides your own to pay for college. The first bucket is the grant and aid bucket, and includes work study as well. And this is need-based financial aid. And so it's going to use information from the FAFSA or one of the similar forms that we'll talk about in a little bit. And this money does not need to be repaid, which is obviously a great benefit. So what is the FAFSA? It stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. And even if you're not expecting to get aid, we've gotten to the point where you probably need to fill in the FAFSA anyway. A lot of schools are requiring it for scholarships. And there's actually a proposed law that would make the FAFSA mandatory for all students looking to go on to higher education. And it's used to determine the eligibility for aid and things, but also loans. Like I said, some schools require it if they're going to offer scholarships now. And so it's becoming something where maybe a few years ago, if you were in a good situation, you wouldn't have to fill in the FAFSA. It's getting more and more that everybody has to do it at this point. The FAFSA used to be quite complicated, and a few years ago, Congress passed, and then it got signed into law, the FAFSA Simplification Act. And even though it was a few years ago that it got passed, it doesn't start until now. And that's why this year, instead of October 1st for the FAFSA form coming out, it was December 1st this year. And it did simplify things. Questions are down from 100 to 36, which is great. There's more automation and more pulling data from sources to fill in those required fields instead of you having to look up the information. That's all great. But it also changes what's assessed and how things are assessed. And that's going to impact, among others, small business owners, farmers, and also large families. The FAFSA and the formula used to factor in if you had multiple students in college at the same time, and they would adjust what your family was able to provide based on the number of students you have in college. That is no longer going to be a factor on the form. And so if you have 3 kids in college, you used to get a nice little break in the results on your FAFSA. That is no longer the case going forward. It would be far too easy and simple to just have one form, just the FAFSA though. So of course we've got other schools that use different profiles as well. So there's about 400 different private schools that use the College Scholarship Service or CSS profile. And then you've got another 20 that use the consensus EFC method. And those are schools like Northwestern, MIT, Notre Dame, schools that have traditionally given aid based only on need. They've never done it on merit. And these are basically private schools. And so since they're giving away their own money and not the federal government's money, they're a lot stingier. They try to look at a fuller picture of a family's financial standing so that they can hold on to more of their money instead of giving it away, but also having that money available for families that need it. One of the reasons I think it's so hard to wrap your head around all of the timing of the financial aid process is because none of it seems to overlap or line up correctly. So if you have a senior in high school now and they're going to college in the fall of 2024, then they will be starting school in the tax year 2024. But for the financial aid forms, they're going to be assessing the income from the parents and the student from 2022 and the assets from when, for example, the FAFSA is filled out in 2023. And then the second semester for the student is in 2025, but it doesn't change anything yet until we get back to the fall of 2025, and then the income from 23 and the assets from 24. And none of those really line up all that smoothly. And so I think it's hard to get your head around the timing of all of that. But I do think this chart does a good job of trying to explain how it all works together and where those dates kind of line up as you go. That concludes our run through the grant and aid bucket, and now it's time to move on to the scholarship bucket. This is, of course, Leslie Knope from the outstanding television show Parks and Rec, saying, "Our kids will be geniuses. They'll get scholarships. Half my tuition was paid for by the Indiana Scholarship for Pretty Blondes Who Like to Read. It's now called the Virginia Woolf Prize. It was a different time." Scholarships are obviously great. It's free money for usually college, and we hear about them all the time for academics or athletics, but there's obviously many more scholarships out there. And we're going to go through some of the differences and some of the similarities that are out there in the scholarship world. I break scholarships down into two separate groups. The first is scholarships given by a specific institution. And those are going to be scholarships that you have to use at that particular school. And they're going to control the process. They're going to control the criteria, the amount, all of those kind of things. And then, like I said, that money has to be used at that specific school. The other group is publicly available scholarships. And there's a broad range of organizations that sponsor scholarships like these. And so these are scholarships that can be used no matter where the student goes to school. And the organization that is doing the scholarship, they will set the criteria and they will control the process. And it's probably going to be maybe part of a contest. You might have to write a paper or shoot a video. But then that dollar amount, and it could be small, but it could be quite large as well, is available to be used, again, no matter where the child chooses to go to college. And these scholarships are out there. There are lots of organizations that do them, but they can be a little difficult to find. Because these scholarships can be so difficult to find, a lot of websites have popped up as kind of scholarship databases. And I've listed a few here, but there are so many more. They all boast features to differentiate themselves. And so you're going to have to kind of review what the features are on a given website to see if it makes sense for you, your student. Some are free, but not all. So you're going to want to make sure you know that from the beginning. And in the ones I've looked at, if it's free, it says it right up front. So keep an eye out for that as well. And I don't think you need to have a profile in 10 of these different scholarship databases. 2 or 3 is probably good enough to make sure you're hitting basically all of the available scholarships out there that you might qualify for. There, I think, is a misconception out there too that scholarships are only for the very best of students, the very highest of achievers, and that's not always the case. So this is the information about the David Letterman Scholarship at Ball State University, and I want to highlight something that this scholarship is kind of famous for. I have blown up the first line of the criteria for this scholarship, and if you notice, the very first line is grades are not to be a criterion. Your grades have to be good enough to get into Ball State University, but once that is achieved, then the grades are not a factor in this scholarship. Instead, it's about creativity. And Letterman did this because he was not a great student, but he's a pretty creative guy, and it worked out well for him in his life, obviously. So he made this scholarship and endowed it so that grades weren't a factor. Instead, it was other personality traits that will help somebody out in life. That wraps up scholarships, and now we're going to move on to the newest bucket that's out there, which is merit aid. Merit aid is sometimes lumped in with scholarships, but I like to separate them out because even though schools might use the terms interchangeably, they are slightly different. This is money that schools use to incentivize the students that they want to attend. And it could be based on geography. There are lots of stories I've heard of students in northern states who get money from southern schools to come down and attend there so they can kind of diversify their geographic footprint of students. It might be based on a major that they are focusing on and really want to build up that particular part of the school. It really could be anything that the school chooses. This is a nebulous pile of money that the school uses basically to recruit the type of student that they want. The part of merit aid that's a little frustrating, at least as far as I'm concerned, is nothing's standardized. And I don't mean from school to school, I mean even from year to year with the school. It's often not standardized. Like I said, they're using it as a recruiting tool. And so maybe your student one year is someone they want to recruit and a similar student the next year is not. Some schools do offer transparency, and I think that's a huge benefit for the schools. They will actually lay out test scores and GPA on a grid and tell you what kind of merit aid you might be looking at. I think that's a great thing, but for most, it's not going to be that clear. It's not going to be that transparent, and it is going to be a little bit hit and miss from year to year. I lumped these first three buckets together for one very important reason, and that's because the money that comes from grants or scholarships or merit aid doesn't need to be paid back, which is obviously what we're looking for. Loans, on the other hand, do need to be paid back, and we're going to cover those right now. So at a very basic level, a student loan is just borrowing money to pay for college, and then it has to be repaid. And I put an asterisk there because there are some exceptions, and I'm going to talk about those in a few minutes. But I want to say loan is not a four-letter word. I mean, it is, but it's not one of those four-letter words. And yes, we want to avoid using loans if possible. But when they're used responsibly, they can be very beneficial. This chart might look confusing at first blush, but I'm going to break it down in just a minute. But first, I want to just talk about the difference. So the blue bars, those are the percentage of borrowers with student loan debt outstanding. And the orange bars, that's how much they owe. 75% of borrowers owe less than $40,000. And if you've had to go out searching for either a new or used car in the last couple of years, you know it's not even the best car in the world is going to be $40,000. And so most borrowers, they fall into this range, but it only makes up about 39% of the outstanding debt. And even if you move even farther to the left, 54%, so just more than half, owe less than $20,000. At the high end of the range, we have 7% of borrowers that owe more than $100,000. And at the high end, we have a lot of doctors and lawyers, professions that require additional years of expensive school that really run the bill up. But with a likelihood that when they come out and have a job, they'll be highly paid professionals as well. The top 7% owes 38% of the outstanding debt. If you remember from just a second ago, that's basically the same total amount of dollars as the lower 75% of debt holders out there. I'm going to cover three of the more, I don't want to call them popular, but I'm going to say the more commonly used types of student loans. And the first, and in my opinion the best, are the Federal Direct Stafford loans. But these are limited both in a given year and for a lifetime in the total amount of money that a student can borrow. So you have to keep an eye on that a little bit. Subsidized Stafford loans are great because the federal government pays interest when the student's enrolled more than half the time during the grace period, which is 6 months after graduation, and in cases of deferment. Unsubsidized, obviously, we don't have any of those benefits. And this is one of the reasons people fill in their FAFSA form, but you also have to pass a credit check to qualify. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the repayment options of Stafford loans and all the other loans we're going to talk about, but I do just want to mention it briefly. So there's a standard repayment like you would with any other loan that's out there. There's a growing number of income-driven repayment plans, and there are several different kinds, and those are great because hopefully that keeps from crippling a student when they come out of school and have their first job, which probably isn't going to be the best paying job they ever have in their life. The income-driven repayment plan looks at their income and sets their loan payment based on that. And there's a factor involved, and it depends on which plan you choose. But it is a really great way to not have a huge debt payment that you just can't afford. You can do a federal direct consolidation and maybe pull in a couple different loans together. And then forgiveness. And I talked about a little while ago when I had that asterisk after must be repaid. And I'm not specifically talking about the federal government wiping away student loan debt, although that has been talked about plenty over the last few years. What I'm talking about are programs like public service loan forgiveness, where if you work a public service job for a set period of time, whatever's left as the principal amount on your loan is taken care of. It goes away, disappears. And there are specifics in both job and how you're repaying your loan that have to be met to qualify for that. And it used to be really difficult, but that has gotten simpler over the last couple of years as well. And so more and more people are qualifying and using this benefit to pay off their student loans. The next kind of student loans I'm going to talk about are private loans, and they're going to be issued by banks or credit unions or maybe even the college themselves. And the rate is going to be based on the credit score, credit history, repayment term, just like a regular loan. But because we're talking about a 17, 18-year-old kid at the start, it's probably not someone with an extensive credit history. Private institutions are probably going to be looking for a cosigner, and so parents should be aware of that. Repayment terms for private student loans are very limited. Basically, you have the same kind of repayment possibility you might have with any other loan that you go through a bank or credit union for. So the beneficial repayment options, like under the Stafford loans, they don't exist with private loans. The third kind of loan I'm going to talk about are Parent Plus loans. And in this case, the parent is the borrower. But you have to be very careful with these because the borrowing limit on these loans is the cost of attendance minus any financial assistance received. And so it can be really easy for parents to run up a gigantic debt that they are responsible for to send their student to college. Parent Plus loans are part of a federal program, so there are a few more options available to pay them off. But again, remember, this is the parent's responsibility to pay, not the student's. I know I covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time, so I just want to share this chart and show the differences between Stafford loans, private loans, and then those Parent Plus loans. And again, to me, the biggest thing is the Parent Plus loans, the parent is the borrower and the responsible party for paying them off. The other kind of loans, it's the student or the student and their cosigner that are going to be responsible for paying off the loans. As you can see, and I think I explained, the Stafford loans are the best ones to use. And then from there, it becomes an individual and family conversation about should we use private or should we use Parent Plus loans for the rest. That covers those 4 buckets, but we're not quite done yet because I've got some tips and tricks. You'll want to make sure you check the FAFSA for errors. Make sure all of the information got pulled into the correct field and it's the right dollar amounts. Award letters from schools are going to vary wildly, and I recommend creating a spreadsheet or something similar to lay out the offers from schools so you're trying to compare apples to apples down those columns. Because nothing is standardized, it can be a little confusing, and some of those letters from schools will be so very different, it's going to be hard to wrap your head around unless you have it laid out in an organized fashion. And negotiation is allowed, and it can happen, and they do have an impact, but don't call it a negotiation, call it an appeal. I think appeals are so important that I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking specifically about them. So the appeal should come from the student and be genuine. Don't appeal just to drive the price down to then try to take that offer to another school to get a better deal. Don't try to get in the center of a bidding war. You're going to want to do your homework. Check where schools might overlap. And if you have 2 schools that kind of compete over the same student from the same area and the offers from the 2 are very different, maybe then you can use that if the school your student wants to attend is the one with the higher price. The more specific you can be, the better, and have a reason. We talked in the FAFSA section a little while ago about income being assessed from 1.5 to 2 years ago. Well, it's possible a parent has changed jobs or gotten a pay cut since then. If that's the case, you're going to want to have documentation ready to be able to show the college. And I think it goes without saying, but don't lie. Don't try to pull one over on them. And also, it's going to be really hard to negotiate once you've already committed and your deposit money is in. So what you want to do is negotiate or appeal early and accept late. Make sure you're appealing to a school that your child has a genuine interest in attending. Don't spend time on the 5th choice. Spend time on the first choice. You don't want to waste your time or theirs appealing where the student doesn't want to go. And make sure you're explaining why you would be a great addition to their campus as you go through this appeal. And one thing to keep in mind is now that the FAFSA doesn't factor in siblings, that might be a really good argument for a big family to make to demonstrate why you might need a little additional financial help. This might be a good thesis statement for a sample appeal, where your child, your student writes, I would love to attend XYZ University. If I could receive X dollars in additional support, it would make the financial decision much more manageable for my family and me. Now, obviously, you're going to have to add more detail and more context, but this might be a good thesis statement to build that letter around. And remember, the school doesn't have to negotiate, but it's hard to see them holding an appeal against a potential student. A few other factors to consider. The money has to work. Attending an expensive college is great, but if you're majoring in something that's probably going to lead to a low-paying career, it's just not going to be the best move. Community college can be a great path for many, especially those who maybe don't have what they want to be when they grow up figured out quite yet. But you do want to make sure, as you're looking at attending a 4-year school after, that those credits are going to transfer, so you don't wind up paying for the same class twice. Will your student, what they're majoring in, is a bachelor's degree good enough to be out in the job world, or are they going to have to go to a post-grad program? That's going to impact loans and also how savings are spent assuming that the savings are limited, which is the case for most of us. And then you want to be as logical as possible. When I was choosing between my final two choices, I was looking at either Hope or Western Michigan, and my top choice was Hope, but it just financially didn't work for my family, so I wound up at Western. And by any measure, it worked out. I met my wife at Western. I met lifelong friends there. I got a great education. It all worked out. But still, every now and then, I'll hear my dad say, "Wish we could have sent you to Hope." And that parental guilt, I get, is a real thing. But maybe it helps to reframe it in your head that you're setting your student up for success because they didn't take on more cost than they could handle and don't have a crippling loan balance as they go out into the real world. As we wind down, I just want to share a few resources. There are certainly several reputable websites out there, but collegeboard.org is the first one that comes to mind for me. They have a ton of information covering a broad range of college topics, and I think it's a great place to start. I love the book, The Price You Pay for College. It's got a lot of information, but the chapters are fairly short, and they're all on a very specific topic. So it makes it easy, if it's perhaps something that isn't going to impact your family, to skip a chapter. For example, I have 3 boys. There's a chapter in there about picking an all-women's college. It's not going to be an issue for me and my family, so I just skipped that chapter. And it's really, the book is set up in a way that you can do that quite easily and pick up where it's going to apply to you and your family. And then each college and university, they're going to have information on their own websites. These are recruiting pieces for the colleges, and so they're going to have a lot of information out there. Sometimes, depending on the school, it's going to be easier to find some information than others, but it is all going to be on there, and they're going to provide a lot of that information that you and your student might be looking for. I know I covered a lot of information in this presentation, and you may have some questions. Please reach out to me. My email's at the bottom of the screen. Happy to answer questions that you might have. And also, if there's a topic you wish I would have covered but didn't, let me know that as well. And that way I can shape this presentation into something that is useful for families, parents, students as they get ready for college.